Insightful viewers, welcome to this week's Healthy Living program, where we'll examine the harmful effects of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, in our food supply. GMOs are produced by transferring genes from one species into the genetic code of another. GM foods have not been scientifically proven safe. Aware of the dangers, some countries have already banned all GMO crops, most notably Switzerland and Bulgaria. Across Europe, there is widespread consumer opposition to GMO products. In Japan, genetically modified foods are not grown commercially. In India, the national government prohibited the planting of GM eggplant in 2010 after the Environment Minister concluded there was insufficient data showing that the crop is safe for human consumption or the environment. To find out more about the inherently hazardous process of producing GMOs, let's first hear from Jeffrey M. Smith, an expert on the subject and also founder of the US-based Institute for Responsible Technology, which informs policymakers and the public about the perils of genetically modified foods.
You take a gene, let's say you want to create a corn plant that produces its own pesticide. So you take the gene from the soil bacterium Bt and you make millions of copies of the gene and you put it into a gun and you shoot that gun into a plate of millions of cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. Then you clone those cells into a plant. Now the process of insertion plus cloning causes massive collateral damage in the DNA of the plant. 2 to 4% is different. There can be hundreds or thousands of mutations. And there's also a holistic effect. When you insert a single gene, up to 5% of the natural genes in the plant can change their levels of expression and produce too much or too little protein. What this does when you change that much in the DNA is that the RNAs can change, the proteins can change, and the byproducts of metabolism can change. So you could have increased levels of allergens, increased levels of toxins or carcinogens, or completely new allergens and toxins and carcinogens that have never been in the plant before. Now, these are not evaluated.
The American Academy of Environmental Medicine has issued a warning urging the public to avoid GM foods and adding, "There is more than a causal association between GM foods and adverse health effects. There is causation." A growing body of evidence points to disastrous health outcomes from GMOs, such as premature aging, immune dysfunction, cancer, multiple organ damage, and reproductive disorders. The respected non-profit environmental group Greenpeace International strongly opposes the cultivation of genetically modified crops as well.
I think first it's wrong to play God, but of course somebody pointed out that all of science is a little bit like that. Yeah, we appreciate, we are not anti-science, but in agriculture the playing God goes one step further because you're releasing those organisms into the environment. They're not in your laboratory, they go into the environment, they interact with other species, they interact with the ecosystem. So there are potentially irreversible effects. There are also health effects from consuming genetically modified crops. We don't need it. There's enough organic techniques and technologies available to produce food to feed the world.
In 2009, Dr. Don Lotter, who has a doctorate in agroecology, wrote an article published in the International Journal of Sociology of Agriculture and Food entitled "The Genetic Engineering of Food and the Failure of Science." The paper discusses the hazards, lack of safety testing, and deficient consumer protection with respect to GMOs. The author states that the principles underlying research by the GM industry are flawed, giving the example of the cauliflower mosaic virus promoter, or KMVT15, which is used to activate foreign genes inserted into GM plants. This virus is dangerous because it is not neutralized when it enters the human digestive system, but instead promotes the transfer of genes from the GMO to bacteria in the digestive system that are responsible for 80% of our immune system function. Jeffrey M. Smith is deeply concerned that GMOs will seriously injure human health through the transfer of genetic information from modified foods to intestinal bacteria.
The fact that genes transfer to our gut bacteria gets worse when you think of what can transfer. The corn and cotton that are genetically engineered, there's varieties that produce their own pesticide. So if the gene that produces the pesticide transfers, it might turn our intestinal bacteria into living pesticide factories.
The pesticide produced in GM corn and cotton, called Bt toxin, has already had damaging effects on those exposed to the spray version of the bacteria, as well as those farming Bt-generating GM crops.
When it was used in its natural form as a spray in the Pacific Northwest, hundreds of people got allergic reactions or flu-like symptoms. Some had to go to the hospital. So it obviously affects humans and mammals. Now, if you look at the symptoms of the people who were sprayed in Washington State, and you look at the symptoms of the farm workers in India who are picking the cotton that's genetically engineered to produce the Bt toxin, they're the same symptoms. They're getting rashes, upper respiratory reactions, fever. Some had to go to the hospital. Now, the Bt toxin that's in the crop, however, is thousands of times more concentrated than the natural spray. It's designed to be more toxic, and it has properties of a known allergen. And it also cannot be washed off the plant because it's produced by little spray bottles in every cell of the plant in every bite. So many people believe that Bt toxin, as produced by the genetically modified corn and cotton, is extremely dangerous. And the idea that we have living pesticide factories inside us is totally high on the yuck factor, I'll tell you that.
A study of a group of pregnant and non-pregnant women in Canada found that 93% of the pregnant women had Bt toxin in their blood and 80% had it in their umbilical cord blood, while the toxin was detected in 69% of the non-pregnant women's blood. The scientists believe the source of the Bt toxin was meat, eggs and milk eaten by study participants that came from livestock who consumed GM corn. The researchers stated in a paper published in the journal Reproductive Toxicology, this is the first study to highlight the presence of pesticides associated with genetically modified foods in maternal, fetal and non-pregnant women's blood.
Bt toxin is a toxin. A Bt toxin crop is not a higher yielding crop, it's a toxin producing crop. Herbicide resistance crops are resistant to herbicide, therefore you can spray them with higher doses of glyphosate. That's more toxins in our farms, not more food. To date, there is not a single GMO that has produced more food than comparative crops.
During the 1980s, 37 people in the United States died and 5,000 were sickened after taking a dietary supplement that contained GM bacteria. In another case, illustrative of why it's unwise to tamper with nature, is that people who were allergic to Brazil nuts were found to have reactions after consuming GM soy, which had a Brazil nut gene in it.
Genetic engineering is a very crude and very violent technology. One of the biggest lies being told all over the place, especially in the context of the food crisis, is that GMOs will solve the problem of hunger. They cannot, because the technology is not designed to increase production. The technology is designed to put more toxics into the crop. Genetically engineered seeds are not solving hunger. They are not bringing prosperity to our farmers. They're killing our farmers. And agriculture without GMOs is a peaceful agriculture. GMO-free agriculture is a prosperous agriculture. GMO-free agriculture is the only way humanity should move into the future.
The solution, of course, is sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture which sustains the land, the livelihoods that depend on it, Millions, literally hundreds of millions of people depend on agriculture for their daily living. So an agricultural system that takes care of the land, takes care of the people, does not use chemicals, and is therefore good for the consumers. That's sustainable agriculture. So this is the kind of thing that Greenpeace would campaign on. So that's what we would do for sustainable agriculture.
Supreme Master Ching Hai has spoken on various occasions regarding the harmful effects of GMOs.
Nowadays, many people try to do this so-called genetically modified food. So sometimes we eat the vegetarian food and we don't even know that there are animal substance in it, scientifically speaking. Meat is being linked to disease of all kinds, with cholesterol, obesity, heart diseases, and strokes. So if we put meat or animals substance into vegetables, then we will also have similar effect, more or less. I think we should not mess up with nature and play God. Whatever nature has already offered to us, that is good enough. There might be more incurable disease that come from GMO that we don't even know will happen yet. Right now, even if we just eat the normal meat, and we have so many incurable disease already, if we mix it with vegetable, maybe we will have more incurable disease and more strange disease that we don't even know how to deal with in the future. So it's better to have organic vegan farming method.
We as consumers can stop the GMO industry from further ruining our health and planet. First, we can refuse to purchase GM products. When shopping, we can choose to buy organic, locally produced vegetables and fruit instead. Second, we can write to our government officials to voice our opposition to GMOs. Third, we can spread the word about the high risks of genetically modified crops to our friends and family. These steps, along with organic vegan farming, will help ensure we have a GMO-free future for our children. For more information on the dangers of GMO foods, please visit the following websites: Institute for Responsible Technology, www.responsibletechnology.org, Greenpeace International, www.greenpeace.org, Navdonya, www.navdonya.org. Benevolent viewers, thank you for your presence on this edition of Healthy Living. May paradise soon be realised on our earth through the organic plant-based diet.
For more details, please see www.suprememastertv.com/HL.
Organic farming, a sustainable solution. Organic soil management minimizes fossil fuel use, removes atmospheric CO2 emissions from the air. If organic practices were implemented on the planet's 3.5 billion tillable acres, nearly 40% of current CO2 emissions could be absorbed. Source: Rodale Institute, USA. Try organic today. Be veg, go green to save the planet. For more information, please visit suprememastertv.com/be-veg.
Hello, conscientious viewers, and welcome to Healthy Living. On March 11th, 2011, a massive 9.0 magnitude earthquake with accompanying tsunami struck Japan's east coast, causing widespread destruction. Among the facilities seriously damaged was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant complex. The resulting explosions and reactor meltdowns at the plant released large amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere surrounding land and the Pacific Ocean, raising grave concerns about the short and long-term health effects from the nuclear disaster. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, a US-based science advocacy organization, the radioactive isotopes which pose the largest cancer-causing risk following a nuclear accident are iodine-131 and cesium-137. On today's program, we present an interview with American author, independent researcher, and lecturer on radiation safety, Mr. Paul Zimmerman, who will discuss some of the very serious health concerns related to this power generation method. He is the author of A Primer in the Art of Deception, a book about the dangers of depleted uranium weapons and human exposure to nuclear radiation. Nuclear plants use fission to produce power from highly concentrated forms of uranium or plutonium fuel. Under normal circumstances, the fuel and fission byproducts from a generating station are contained within a support structure called the core. But if the core becomes damaged, massive amounts of radioactive material may be released into the atmosphere or leak into the ground.
What happens with nuclear power is that human beings concentrate radioactive material. They bring it out of the earth, they put it together in a concentrated form which doesn't exist in nature. Or they run it through nuclear reactors and create a tremendous amount of waste. And it's because of this concentrated material, it has to be isolated from life. And any time that it escapes its confinement and comes in contact with life, there's biological hazard, whether it's animal life, plant life, human life. And so the technology is only effective if it can be contained. And we see enough examples where containment fails, and then people suffer.
Volumes of research clearly demonstrate that contact with radioactive material can cause severe health conditions. The government of Japan has imposed a 20-kilometer no-go zone around Fukushima plant to protect citizens from radioactive contamination. This means no one is allowed to live in the zone, and people cannot enter this area unless they have special permission.
There's no doubt that fission products have been released into the environment. Fission products are a result of nuclear reactions, and it's either from the reactors themselves or from the waste storage ponds of the used reactor fuel. But if fission products are being released, you've got a very hazardous situation. And particularly the inhalation of that material creates a threat to health, even in low doses. But there's a lot of information from a similar accident from Chernobyl that very low doses created illness in the population, particularly childhood leukemia in children that were still in the wombs of their mothers developing when the mothers were exposed to this kind of radiation. Or there were a high incidence of infant birth defects. There's a tremendous amount of study that was carried out in Russia and the Ukraine that testifies to this.
What happens when radioactive materials enter the food supply?
One of the most important things that are often not recognized is that the human body is an accumulator of radioactivity in the environment. So they might pick up a little from this vegetable and a little from this water and from milk that has entered the food chain through animals eating contaminated feed, and it's all being concentrated in our bodies. And so the dose that a human being ends up accumulating might be very significant.
As Mr. Zimmerman explains, one of the challenges in determining the health effects of exposure to nuclear materials is that they may not be evident until decades after contact.
Some of the workers that have responded to the accident trying to keep the reactor waste, the used fuel rods, covered with water, they're taking a very high radiation exposure. And those people might suffer acute radiation syndrome and feel it very quickly. In terms of longer-term pathology, we're not going to know for a long time how many people are going to develop thyroid difficulties because of the absorption of iodine 131 into their bodies, or more long-term in terms of cancer rates. So this is one of the insidious problems with nuclear energy, because of the way radiation affects the human body in non-deterministic ways. It takes years or decades to get a picture of the health problem. And by that time, the world has moved on, and they don't take it quite as seriously as they would if they could evaluate the hazard right now.
In 1986, in what is considered the worst disaster in nuclear-powered generation history, a plant in Chernobyl, Ukraine exploded, causing huge amounts of radioactive material to be released into the atmosphere, contaminating humans and animals, agricultural products, and soil in Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and most of Europe. A recent study suggests that Chernobyl's overall impact on human health was much, much more severe than is commonly understood.
There was a book recently published in New York, the Academy of Sciences, and in that book, Chernobyl, Consequences to People and the Environment, they said that between 1986 and 2004, 985,000 people died as a result of Chernobyl. They did deep research and consulted 5,000 sources while they were preparing their report.
The Chernobyl disaster prompted many research studies on its health consequences. Scientists have concluded that, among other deleterious effects, exposure to radiation is linked to increase in thyroid cancer, severe mental retardation in newborns, and genetic damage in humans, animals, and plant life.
A tremendous amount of research has come to light since Chernobyl, and it's proven that the risk factors that are published by the radiation protection agencies are inadequate. They do not accurately represent the health detriment that's produced in a population that's exposed to radiation.
The fuel used in nuclear plants is also an extreme threat to human health.
There's a tremendous amount of research that's been done on the toxicology of uranium. How hazardous is it, and how does it affect the human body, and how does it affect the cells? And things that were never known before are coming to light in terms of the radiation emitted from uranium. And research has shown that uranium is genotoxic. It's toxic to DNA. It is mutagenic. It causes mutations in DNA. It's cytotoxic. It causes adverse functioning in cells. It's heterotogenic. It has the capacity of affecting fetal development. And it's also a neurotoxin. So anybody that brushes aside uranium saying, it can't be hazardous, is not keeping up with the modern research.
Even living in the vicinity of a nuclear power plant can affect one's health. Research by the German Federal Office for Radiation Protection shows that children living within 5 kilometers of nuclear generating stations are more than twice as likely to get leukemia as those living farther away. And Mr. Zimmerman has another concern about nuclear plants. The spent fuel remains toxic and highly dangerous for extremely long periods.
Iodine 131, which is escaping from the reactors in Japan, the half-life of that radioisotope is approximately 8 days. So, they say generally that if you count 10 generations of radioactive decay, it decays to harmless levels. So for radioactive iodine, after 80 days, it will no longer be hazardous. But now if you take something like plutonium, Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So if you're waiting for it to decay over 10 generations, you're talking about 240,000 years that it has to be isolated from life in order to be completely safe. And now the major fuel in a nuclear reactor is uranium-238, and that has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. And so you're going to have to wait 45 billion years before the uranium is totally harmless.
Given the spent fuel remains a gigantic biohazard for the length of time that is beyond comprehension, how do we keep not only ourselves, but those that will live on Earth long after us safe from these substances?
Then the question also becomes the disposal of radioactive waste. And I think it's a bit of a folly to believe that human beings can think thousands of years into the future, that they know what's going to happen in such a way that they can keep that radioactive waste from escaping into the water, escaping into the environment, and affecting generations of people that we can't even imagine yet. So we create all this waste, and we have very imperfect ways of anticipating what's going to happen to it. But it's going to be lethal to all living creatures wherever it escapes.
The byproducts from nuclear power generation jeopardize not only our own lives, but also those of our animal co-inhabitants.
Once again, the question has to be asked, do human beings have the authority or the right to release dangerous radioactive material into the environment that we share with all other creatures? Though human beings might be protected from radiation that's washed into the ocean, what about the fish? Are we stewards of the earth, protecting the earth, or is the garbage that we release into the world affecting life in ways that we don't even think about? But we're poisoning our common planet and poisoning our fellow human beings, and we are destroying values and cultures in the belief that our way, our technological way, is the way of the future.
What is the solution to the life-threatening problems that are caused by nuclear power plants? Immediately switching to safer, greener sources of energy is the only option.
We have to find a sustainable way of living and more appropriate technology. I'm very curious to see what's going to happen in Japan after this event. Choices have to be made about lifestyle. What kind of lifestyle do you want to live? And is it worth having energy production that can do what is happening now in Japan? Is it worth that to continue? Maybe the Japanese can be the conscience of the whole world, because they're now having more intimate experience with what it means to be contaminated.
Many thanks to you, Paul Zimmerman, for your diligent research and providing the public with a clearer understanding of the highly hazardous health effects of nuclear power. May your important work continue to help shift our world to sustainable power sources that are in harmony with planet Earth. For more information on Paul Zimmerman and his book, The Primer in the Art of Deception, please visit www.du-deceptions.com. Enlightened viewers, thank you for your presence today on Healthy Living. May humanity always embrace only what is good and beneficial for our world.
For more details, please visit www.suprememastertv.com/HL.